15 minutes before 600 people watched my son fail to show up for the biggest night of my life, I had no idea I was about to hand $1 million to a stranger's child instead of my own, and that by morning the entire internet would be picking my family apart. What I found hidden inside 3 old cardboard boxes 2 nights later would break my son in a way I never wanted, and it would take a young man who wasn't even my blood to teach me what family actually means. If you've ever given everything to the people you love and gotten silence back, stay with me until the end, because this story isn't finished until an empty chair gets filled, and you will not see how by whom. If this story is already pulling at something in you, hit like and subscribe now, because I promise you're going to want to see how it ends. My name is Arthur Sterling, and for 40 years I built things that outlasted the men who forgot to say thank you for them. Bridges, conveyor lines, a career. On the night my company finally decided to honor me for it, I discovered that the one thing I had spent 4 decades trying to hold together, my family, had already come apart in my hands without my noticing. The grand hall of the Chicago Continental Center looked absolutely magnificent that evening. Crystal chandeliers threw warm gold light across nearly 600 folding chairs, each one facing a stage draped in navy and silver, Continental Precision Industries colors, the same colors I had worn on a hard hat the first day I walked onto that factory floor in 1986. Waiters moved silently between round tables. A string quartet tuned quietly near the entrance. Above the stage hung a banner that read, in letters 3 feet tall, 40 years of integrity, honoring Arthur Sterling. I stood near the front, in a suit I had rented because I never saw the sense in owning one. I'd wear twice a decade, and I felt something I wasn't prepared to feel, pride, sitting uneasily beside dread. Because the seat in the very front row, the one with the small white card that read Julian Sterling, was still empty, and the clock above the double doors said we had 15 minutes left. My phone buzzed in my breast pocket. I already knew somehow before I even looked. Dad, Clara's migraines are back bad. Doctor says she needs to get away before it turns into a full episode. We're flying to the resort tonight. She booked it weeks ago, and it's non-refundable. So sorry to miss tonight. Hope it goes great. Proud of you. No call. No voice cracking with apology. Just a paragraph typed with one thumb, while, I imagined, someone else packed his suitcase for him. I read it twice, the way you check a blueprint measurement you already know is wrong, hoping the second look will change the number. It didn't. I put the phone back in my pocket, and I did not feel the surge of anger I expected. What I felt instead was quieter and colder, like standing in a room after the furnace has been off for hours. You don't notice the exact moment it got cold, only that it has been cold for a while, and you were too busy to notice. I walked to the little easel beside the front row, slid the white card out from its slot, and smoothed it flat between my thumb and forefinger the way I used to smooth technical drawings before I signed off on them. Then I folded it once, gently, and tucked it into my breast pocket, directly over my heart, the way a man keeps a photograph he isn't ready to look at, but isn't ready to throw away either. An event coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard and a kind, worried face, touched my elbow. Mr. Sterling, would you like us to remove the extra chair? We can close the row up before the cameras. Leave it, I said. The chair stays. She hesitated, glanced at the seat, then at me. And something in my face must have told her not to ask why, because she only nodded and stepped away. I'm not, by nature, a man who makes scenes. 40 years on a factory floor teaches you that the loudest man in the room is rarely the one solving the problem. So I did not raise my voice, and I did not check my phone again, and I did not let the 200 employees filing past me see anything on my face except the calm of a man who has weathered worse storms than this one, even though, God help me, I could not immediately think of one. People kept approaching me in those last few minutes, men I'd trained 30 years ago, now gray-haired supervisors themselves, shaking my hand and telling me what an honor it was to be there. A young engineer I barely knew asked if I'd sign the commemorative program, and I did, my handwriting steadier than I felt. Every kind word landed strangely that night, the way compliments do when part of you is somewhere else entirely, 300 miles away, in a hotel room I'd never see, imagining my son zipping a suitcase while my ceremony started without him. I kept the smile in place. It is, I have found, one of the few genuinely useful skills 40 years in management ever taught me. The ability to hold two entirely different weathers inside the same body at once, and let only the fair one show on your face. I thought, briefly, of calling Julian back, of telling him plainly what his absence would cost, of demanding he turn the car around. But my late wife Eleanor's voice came to me then, clear as if she were standing at my shoulder, the way it sometimes still did after 11 years. Don't react while you're hurting, Arthur. Wait until you can think straight. She had been right about nearly everything in 38 years of marriage, and I saw no good reason to start doubting her now, simply because she wasn't there to be right about it in person. It was then that I noticed him. Near the back of the hall, half hidden behind a pillar, as though he were trying to apologize for taking up space, stood a young man in a suit that had clearly been bought second-hand and pressed within an inch of its life. Every crease sharp, every button aligned, the kind of care a man puts into something when it's the only nice thing he owns. He kept glancing at the exit like he was calculating how fast he could leave without anyone noticing he'd come. Elias Vance. Thomas Vance's boy. Thomas had died 9 years earlier. Heart, sudden, no warning. The kind of death that leaves a hole shaped exactly like the man who fell into it. He'd been my foreman for 2 decades before that, the closest thing to a brother I had outside of blood, and in the hospital hallway the night before he passed, he'd gripped my hand with more strength than I thought a dying man had left, and said only, "Look after my boy, Arthur. He's got more in him than he knows." I told him I would. I had spent 9 years trying to keep that promise quietly, the way you're supposed to keep promises to the dead, without making a production of it. I lifted my hand and waved him forward. He blinked, pointed at his own chest as if to say, "Me?" And when I nodded, he crossed that long hall like a man walking toward a verdict rather than an invitation. "Mr. Sterling, I don't think I'm supposed to be up here. I just wanted to see the ceremony from—" "Your father would have been sitting here," I said, and I put my hand on the back of the empty chair. "Today this seat is yours." Elias's throat worked. He looked at the little name card slot, empty now, except for the faint outline where the paper had been. "Sir, I couldn't. This is for your son." "My son already told me where he'd rather be," I said, and I heard my own voice come out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Sit down, Elias. It would mean something to me." He sat. His hands, calloused from 12 years of teaching teenagers how to run a lathe safely, folded themselves in his lap the way a man folds his hands in church. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, as though looking at me directly might somehow prove he didn't belong in that row, in the seat where a son should have been sitting, wearing a suit that had probably cost him most of a week's paycheck at the wage a public school shop teacher earns. A few heads nearby turned toward us, curious, and I watched Elias notice it, watched his shoulders climb slightly toward his ears the way a man's do when he's bracing for someone to ask him to leave. Nobody did. If anything, a few of the older employees near us, men who remembered his father from the plant floor, gave him a small nod of recognition, and I saw something in Elias's posture ease, just slightly, at being known. I settled into the chair beside him, and for one long moment before the lights dimmed and the MC's voice rang out over the sound system, I let myself feel the whole of it, the pride of a man who had given this company 40 years of his life and never once cut a corner, braided tight together with the quiet grief of a father who was beginning at 70 years old, in a rented suit, under chandeliers he'd never once been able to afford himself, to understand that his only son had become someone he no longer recognized. The lights went down. The screen behind the podium flickered to life. And whatever this evening was about to become, I understood. Sitting there, with an empty name card folded over my heart and a stranger's son beside me, who felt, in that moment, less like a stranger than my own blood did, I understood that nothing about tonight was going to go the way anyone in that hall expected. The video began the way these things always do, a slow crawl through decades compressed into 5 minutes of music and photographs, as if a man's whole working life could be folded into something small enough to fit between commercial breaks. There I was in 1986, 27 years old, grinning under a hard hat 2 sizes too big. There was the assembly line I'd supervised in the 90s, the safety award from 2003, a photograph of my late wife Eleanor at the company Christmas party, laughing at something just out of frame. The room applauded warmly, and I nodded my thanks, but I was only half listening. I was watching Elias out of the corner of my eye, watching him watch me, with an expression I hadn't seen on a young man's face in a long time, quiet, unguarded gratitude. When the video ended, our CEO, Richard Halloway, walked to the podium. Richard had started on that same factory floor, sweeping metal shavings for tuition money, and he'd never let success erase the memory of it. "I've worked beside Arthur Sterling for 31 years, he said, and in all that time, I never once saw him choose the easy path when the right one was harder." The room quieted. Twice, this company offered Arthur a vice president's office, bigger salary, bigger title, a corner office on the top floor. Twice, he turned it down, because both times it would have meant uprooting his son from his school, his friends, the only home the boy had ever known. Arthur chose to stay small so his family could stay whole. Richard paused, letting that settle over the room. I want you all to understand what that actually cost him. We are talking about a man who could have retired a wealthy executive and instead retires tonight as the most respected floor engineer this company has ever had. That was never an accident. That was a decision, made twice, on purpose, for someone else's sake. I hadn't expected that story to be told. I felt my jaw tighten, not from anger, but from the particular ache of hearing your own quiet sacrifices spoken aloud in front of 600 people, like a private letter read out in court. A maintenance supervisor named Dave Kowalski stood up next, uninvited, and told the room how I'd stayed at the plant overnight during the blizzard of 11, so 3 of the younger night shift workers wouldn't have to risk the roads home. A woman from accounting I barely remembered described through tears how I'd quietly covered her husband's physical therapy bills after his stroke years ago and asked her never to mention where the money came from. I hadn't expected either story. I'd genuinely forgotten both of them, the way you forget most of the small kindnesses you've done, because keeping score was never really the point of doing them. Richard wasn't finished. "What most of you don't know," he continued, "is that for the last 15 years, Arthur has declined every performance bonus this company has offered him. Every single one. Instead, he asked that the money be quietly redirected into something else." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt Elias go very still beside me. "Today," Richard said, "we're making that fund public for the first time. It's called the Sterling Technical Education Trust, and as of this morning, it holds $1,200,000. The gasp that went through the hall was audible even over the sound system. I kept my eyes forward, my hands folded, the way I taught myself to sit through board meetings when the numbers were bad and showing it wouldn't fix anything. "This money will never be paid out as cash to any individual," Richard continued. "Its entire purpose is to fund technical and vocational education for students who couldn't otherwise afford it. Tools, equipment, scholarships, workshop space. And Arthur has asked for one thing in return, that the fund's honorary director, the person entrusted to decide how every dollar is spent, be a man he trusts completely. He looked directly at our row. "Elias Vance, would you please stand?" Elias did not move for a full 3 seconds. I had to nudge his elbow before he rose, shaking, his second-hand suit suddenly looking less like an apology and more like it had been tailored for exactly this moment. Elias has spent 12 years teaching underfunded shop classes with equipment older than his students, Richard said. Arthur has asked that this trust build him a fully equipped mechanical workshop, a real one, so that no kid with Elias's talent ever again has to learn on broken tools. Elias covered his mouth with one hand. I watched 12 years of quiet, unrewarded devotion break open on a grown man's face, right there under the chandeliers, and I felt something in my own chest loosen for the first time in months. I hadn't noticed the phone in the third row, held low and steady by a young marketing associate named Priya, recording every second of it for what she would later tell reporters was just supposed to be for my own TikTok. Honestly, I didn't think anyone outside the company would see it. Anyone outside the company saw it within 4 hours. By the time I got back to my truck that night, the video had 1,100 shares. By the time I reached the highway, it had 40,000. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, someone had already stitched the clip together with a slow piano soundtrack and captioned it simply, "This man deserved better." The algorithm, with the particular cruelty of a machine that doesn't understand cruelty at all, had done something no reporter could have staged even if they'd tried for a week. It placed the clip of Elias weeping over a mechanical workshop directly beside a public Instagram post from 3 hours earlier. My daughter-in-law, Clara, champagne flute raised poolside at a 5-star resort in Scottsdale, captioned, "Finally the vacation we deserve." Some anonymous account had screenshotted the two posts side by side within the hour. No commentary needed, no caption beyond a single laughing, crying emoji, and that image alone had done more damage in 90 minutes than any article could have managed in a week. The internet did the math itself. It didn't need my help. By midnight, Julian's name was trending in 3 different threads. Strangers who had never met my son were calling him ungrateful, entitled, a coward who couldn't be bothered to sit in a chair for 2 hours to watch his own father honored. Someone dug up Julian's LinkedIn profile and pasted his job title into a thread with 40,000 replies. Clara's comment section filled with a particular flavor of public fury reserved for people caught smiling at exactly the wrong moment. Strangers dissected her sundress, her sunglasses, the champagne in her hand, as if each detail were fresh evidence in a trial she hadn't known she was standing. Someone found Julian's work email and flooded it. Someone else found his cell number, and by the time he finally looked at his phone, poolside in Arizona, the notifications had stacked so high, the screen simply refused to load them all at once. I hadn't posted a single word online I hadn't needed to. The empty chair had said everything, and the world, hungry as it always is, for a villain it can safely hate from a distance, had simply filled in the rest. I sat alone in my truck in the parking lot long after the ballroom had emptied, watching my phone light up over and over with numbers I didn't recognize. And I understood, with a heaviness that had nothing to do with pride, that the punishment my son was about to receive wasn't going to come from me at all. It was already loose in the world, and there was no calling it back. I thought about calling Julian myself, just to warn him what was coming before he saw it on his own screen. I even dialed the first 3 digits before I stopped myself. Whatever was about to happen to my son over the next 24 hours, I decided, sitting there in the dark with the engine idling, he was going to have to meet it the way I'd met most things in my life, without anyone softening the landing for him first. 300 miles away, in a hotel suite that cost more per night than I made in a week when Julian was born, my son was staring at his phone the way a man stares at a car crash he's just realized he's inside of. He told me all of this later, once the anger had burned itself down to something closer to honesty. The resort had been beautiful. Infinity pool, private cabana, the kind of silence that costs extra. Clara had ordered champagne within 20 minutes of check-in. And then, somewhere around their second round, a friend had texted her the TikTok, captioned only, "Isn't this your father-in-law?" Clara's reaction, Julian said, wasn't shock, it was arithmetic. $1 million, she kept repeating, pacing the suite in her sundress. Phone clutched so hard her knuckles went white. $1 million too. That's, Julian, that's supposed to be ours. That's your inheritance. He gave your inheritance to some stranger's kid. She scrolled through the comments obsessively, reading the worst of them aloud, in a voice that climbed higher with each one, as if outrage at the Internet's cruelty could somehow cancel out the outrage the Internet had aimed at her. "They're calling me a gold digger," she said. "Do you see this? People who have never met me, calling me a gold digger in front of 200,000 people." Julian told me later that he'd watched her read those comments with something closer to fascination than hurt. The particular fascination of a person watching a story about themselves that they can't quite recognize as true, but also can't look away from. Julian didn't correct her, not that night. He told me later he'd wanted to, some quiet part of him had wanted to say he's not a stranger. Elias practically grew up in our garage, but the louder part of him, the part that had spent 6 years married to a woman who treated every disagreement like a hostile takeover, simply nodded and let her rage fill the room because it was easier than making her rage turn toward him. They cut the vacation short and drove through the night, 12 hours back to Chicago in a rented SUV, Clara alternating between furious phone calls to friends and cold silence. Julian gripping the wheel and staring at a highway that seemed, for the first time in his adult life, to be leading him somewhere he didn't want to go. Here is the strange human thing about pride. It doesn't collapse all at once. It leaks. Somewhere around hour 6 of that drive, Julian told me, he caught himself actually looking at his wife, really looking, the way you look at a stranger on a train, and noticing, with a small, cold shock, that she had not once, in this entire ordeal, said a single word about me. Not "Is your father okay?" Not, "I hope this hasn't been too hard on him." Only the money, only what had been, in her mind, stolen from them. But pride is a stubborn architecture. Even as one wall of it cracked, Julian rebuilt another somewhere else entirely. Somewhere around a rest stop outside Amarillo, he told me, he'd started rehearsing what he would say to me, and the speech that formed in his head had nothing to do with apology. By the time they crossed into Illinois, he had convinced himself of a different story altogether, that his father had done this deliberately, publicly, cruelly, to humiliate him in front of the entire country, to punish him for one missed ceremony by turning him into a national villain overnight. It was, I understood later, a far more comfortable story than the true one. Easier to be furious at a father who'd supposedly set a trap than to sit quietly with the knowledge that he'd simply, thoughtlessly, walked into an empty chair of his own making. They arrived at my house a little after 11 that night, and I heard the SUV in the driveway before I heard the knock, headlights sweeping across my living room curtains, an engine cutting off too hard, 2 car doors slamming within a second of each other. I was in the kitchen, filling the kettle, still in my undershirt and slacks, when the door opened without anyone waiting for me to answer it. I had half expected them. Some fathers can feel a storm coming up the driveway before it ever knocks. Clara came in first, and whatever composure she'd managed on the drive had evaporated somewhere around my front porch. "You had no right," she said, before I'd even turned around. "You had no right to humiliate us like that, on television, in front of the whole company. You made Julian look like some deadbeat in front of millions of strangers who don't know one single thing about our family." I set the kettle on the stove and turned the burner on low. "Would you like tea? Are you serious right now?" "I am always serious about tea, Clara." I took down 3 mugs from the cabinet. Old habit. I still reached for 3 sometimes, even years after Eleanor, and set them on the counter. Sit down, both of you." Julian didn't sit. He stood near the doorway with his hands jammed in his pockets, looking, for the first time since he was a teenager, genuinely uncertain of himself. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about the trust? Why did it have to happen like that?" "In front of everyone. Because I didn't build it for an audience, son. It happened publicly because Richard decided to announce it publicly. I had no more control over that than you did over Priya's phone camera." "You gave away our family's money," Clara said, her voice climbing. "To him. To that opportunist who's been sniffing around your house for years, playing the devoted family friend so he could—" "That's enough." I didn't raise my voice. I have found, over 40 years of managing men, twice as angry as Clara was that night, that volume is rarely the tool that ends an argument. Stillness is. I poured the water over the tea bags and let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable, watching the steam curl up between us while Clara's chest rose and fell, waiting for me to give her something to push against. I didn't give it to her. That money was never your family's money. It was never anyone's money except the company's, offered to me and declined by me 15 separate times for 15 separate years, because I did not need it and I did not want it. It belongs to whoever I decide is worthy of it. And it went to Elias. "Because you love him more than your own son," Clara snapped. I looked at her then, steadily, the way I used to look at a blueprint I already knew had a fatal flaw in it. "I have never once had to wonder whether Elias would show up," I said quietly. "That is the whole of it, Clara. Not love, certainty." Julian flinched like I'd struck him. "And the humiliation you're so angry about," I continued, sliding a mug across the counter toward my son, "didn't come from an empty chair, Julian. It didn't come from a camera or a viral video or a stranger's comment section. It came from the choice you made 24 hours before that ceremony, when you decided a resort mattered more than a promise. The chair was empty because you chose to leave it that way. I only left it standing so everyone could see exactly what that choice looked like." Julian's hand hovered over the mug I'd set in front of him, but he didn't pick it up. He was staring at the counter, as though the wood grain itself might offer him something to say back. I could see the argument building in him still. The old reflex, the one that wanted to explain, to soften, to find some angle where none of this was quite his fault. I watched him reach for it, and for the first time that night, watched him fail to find it. Nobody spoke. The kettle's steam curled up between us, and for a long moment, the only sound in that kitchen was Clara's furious breathing and the low tick of the stove cooling. Clara opened her mouth to fire back. I could see the next accusation forming behind her eyes, but instead of answering her, I walked down the hallway to the spare bedroom and came back carrying 3 cardboard storage boxes, their edges soft with age, Eleanor's handwriting still visible on the side of each one in faded marker. Receipts. Julian. School. Letters. I hadn't opened them myself in years. Dust had settled into the seams of the cardboard, and for a moment, setting them down, I felt the particular ache of disturbing something that had been left quiet on purpose. I set them on the coffee table. Clara rolled her eyes, arms still crossed tight over her chest. "Oh, here we go." The guilt-trip scrapbook. "Julian, we don't have to sit through this. This is exactly the kind of manipulation that—" But Julian was already crouched in front of the coffee table, and something in his face had shifted. The sullen defensiveness of the drive home replaced suddenly by a child's uncertain curiosity. He lifted the lid off the first box. Inside were folders, yellowed and soft at the corners. A canceled check for $400 from a pawn shop on Halsted Street, dated the same month Julian had shattered his kneecap sliding into second base his junior year of high school. The surgery that saved his baseball scholarship, the one his mother and I had told him at the time, was already covered by insurance. It hadn't been. Eleanor's wedding ring had covered the difference. The pawn ticket was still in the folder, stapled to the receipt, her handwriting on a sticky note beside it. "Get it back before Christmas." She never had. We could never afford to. Julian's hands were shaking slightly as he set that folder aside and lifted another. Payroll stubs, 5 years' worth, a night shift differential line item on every single one. The years I'd taken the overnight rotation nobody wanted. The years I told my son I just preferred nights, when the truth was that night shift paid 9% more, and 9% back then was the difference between keeping the house and losing it. He kept pulling folders out, faster now, almost frantic. Mortgage statements from a refinance I'd never mentioned, a stack of tuition invoices from his college years marked paid in full in Eleanor's careful handwriting, each one a full semester ahead of when the balance was actually due, because she'd taken to paying early the moment either of our paychecks cleared, terrified of what might happen if we let the money sit around long enough to be needed for something else. There was a photograph tucked between 2 receipts, Eleanor at the kitchen table with a calculator and a legal pad, doing sums late into the night, a coffee mug going cold beside her elbow, a photo I didn't even remember Julian's own hand had taken, back when he was maybe 15, and thought he was just snapping a candid picture of his mother being funny about her reading glasses. "I thought we were fine," Julian said, almost to himself, flipping through page after page. "I thought, Dad, I genuinely thought we were comfortable. I never once worried about money growing up. Not once." "That was the entire design of it, son," I said quietly. "A worried child doesn't perform well in school. Your mother decided very early that you would never carry a single ounce of the weight we were carrying. She was extraordinarily good at her job." And then, at the bottom of the second box, a manila envelope he almost skipped past, until he saw his mother's name typed across the top in the cold, formal font of a hospital records department. "Dad," Julian said very quietly, "what is this?" Clara had gone silent behind him now, arms still crossed, but no longer speaking. "Your mother didn't just get sick out of nowhere, Julian," I said, and I made myself say it plainly, because I'd decided years ago that if this conversation ever came, I would not soften it into something easier to carry. In 2008, when the recession hit, the bank came very close to foreclosing on this house. I was already working nights. She took on a second job at the hospital, double shifts, 6 days a week, so we wouldn't have to pull you out of school and move somewhere cheaper in the middle of your senior year. She did that for 11 months straight. The stroke that killed her 3 years later, the doctors were very clear it wasn't sudden. It was the compounded damage of a body that had been run past its limits and never given the chance to recover. She didn't die of an illness that found her at random, son. She worked herself into it, on purpose, so you could finish high school in the house you grew up in, with your friends, without ever once knowing how close we came to losing it. I watched something break in my son's face that I had genuinely never seen before. Not at his mother's funeral, not at his wedding, not once in 32 years. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was the sound of a whole structure a man has built his self-image on top of. My parents were fine. We were comfortable. Nothing was ever truly at stake, collapsing all at once, with nothing underneath it to catch the fall. The doctors called it a stroke on the death certificate, I continued, because I had started this, and I would not let myself stop halfway through it. And that was true as far as it went. But your mother's cardiologist told me, quietly, after the funeral, that a body doesn't just decide to fail like that out of nowhere at 58. He said the years of exhaustion, the missed sleep, the stress of watching a mortgage statement every month, like it was a loaded gun, all of that adds up in a person's arteries the same way it adds up on a ledger. She never complained, Julian, not once in 11 months of double shifts. I only found out how bad it had truly gotten years later, going through her old date books, counting the days she'd worked without a single one off. Julian sat back hard on the floor, the pawn shop receipt still in his hand, and he began to cry the way I hadn't seen him cry since he was 7 years old, not composed, not embarrassed, not managed for an audience, but broken open completely, his shoulders shaking, his breath coming in short, ragged pulls. "I didn't know," he said over and over like a man trying to convince a judge. "I didn't know, Dad. I didn't know any of this. I used to complain that this house felt small. I used to be embarrassed to bring friends over because our car was so old. And the whole time, you two were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I know you didn't," I said, and I sat down on the floor across from him, my old knees protesting the whole way down, because some conversations you cannot have from a standing height. "We never wanted you to. That was the whole point, Julian. That was the entire point of everything your mother and I did." He looked up at me, his face wrecked, 32 years old and utterly undone. "Then what kind of son does that make me, that I got to grow up not knowing any of it? And then, the one time it actually cost you something to have me there, in a chair for 2 hours? I chose a pool instead." I didn't answer that question. Some questions aren't mine to answer. They're a man's to sit with. He sat with it for a long time. The house was very quiet. Even Clara, still standing by the window, had stopped talking entirely, her arms no longer crossed but hanging loose at her sides, as though the fight had simply gone out of her, along with everything else in that room. Julian gathered the loose papers back into their folders with a strange, careful tenderness. "The way you handle something you now understand, you should have been handling that way for years." When he finally closed the lid on the last box, he didn't say anything else. He just sat there on the floor of the house he'd grown up in, holding a pawn ticket for a wedding ring he'd never known was missing, and let the silence do the rest of the work that words couldn't. We were still sitting there on the living room floor, Julian wrecked and silent, me with a hand resting on his shoulder, Clara standing rigid by the window with an expression I couldn't quite read, when a soft knock came at the front door. I opened it to find Elias, still in the same second-hand suit from that afternoon, now holding a paper grocery bag with the top of a soup container visible inside. "I saw the lights on," he said. "I know today was a lot for everybody. I brought soup. Figured nobody in this house had eaten since breakfast." Then he noticed Julian on the floor and Clara's cold stare, and he stopped in the doorway. "I'm sorry. I can come back another time." "Stay," I said, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything I'd said that whole long day. Elias stepped inside and moved through my kitchen the way he'd moved through it 100 times before, because he had. He knew which cabinet held the bowls without opening 2 others first. He knew the third burner ran hot and adjusted for it without thinking. On his way past the pantry door, he reached out and, almost absent-mindedly, gave the loose cabinet hinge a quarter turn with a screwdriver he apparently just kept in his jacket pocket, the one that had been squeaking for 2 months and that I hadn't gotten around to fixing. He ladled soup into bowls without being asked, set them down in front of each of us, including himself, and pulled a dish towel from the drawer where I kept dish towels. A drawer I realized that Julian himself probably couldn't have located any more. It struck me, watching him move so easily through a house that wasn't his, that Elias had been coming by for years the way a son comes by, not on holidays with a calendar reminder, but on ordinary Tuesdays, because the gutters needed clearing or because he'd simply been in the neighborhood and thought to check on an old man living alone. Julian watched all of this from the floor, and I saw the exact moment it landed on him. Not the soup, not the kindness, but the sheer familiarity of it. Elias wasn't a guest in this house. He was a fixture in it, in all the small, unglamorous ways that actually mean something, in a way Julian himself had stopped being years ago. "How long?" Julian asked quietly, watching Elias set a napkin beside his bowl without thinking about it. "Have you been coming here?" "A while," Elias said simply, not meeting his eyes, clearly uncomfortable being asked to quantify something he'd never thought of as remarkable. "Your dad helped raise me. This is just what you do." Clara, who had been quiet for almost 10 minutes, a personal record, finally found her voice again, and it came out sharper than ever, sharper than I'd heard it even on the drive over. She'd been pacing near the window this whole time, phone in hand, apparently still reading comments, her face lit blue by the screen in the dim living room. "Unbelievable," she said, not even looking up at first. "You couldn't even let them have this one night. You had to swoop in with your little soup, playing devoted son of the year right on schedule." Elias's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply set the soup container on the counter and reached for a bowl. "He's not playing anything, Clara," I said. "Oh, please, everyone in this family can see exactly what he's doing, circling, waiting. You think we don't know a gold digger when—" "Stop." The word came out of Julian, not me, and it came out with a force that startled all three of us. He rose off the floor, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and for the first time that entire night he looked at his wife the way a man looks at someone he's finally seeing clearly for the first time. "Stop it, Clara, right now." "Excuse me?" "You heard me." His voice was shaking, but it didn't waver. "Elias has shown up for my father for years. Years, Clara. Quietly. Never once asking for anything. And I've been so busy chasing your version of a good life that I let a stranger become more of a son to my own father than I was." He looked at her, and something in his eyes had gone very still, very final. "Do you understand what I found in those boxes tonight? My mother worked herself to death so I could have an easy childhood. And I've spent the last 6 years complaining that our vacation house wasn't big enough. I'm done, Clara. I want you to leave. Not just tonight. I think this is over." Clara stared at him, waiting, I think, for him to take it back, the way he always had before. There had always, in 6 years of marriage, been a version of Julian who folded first, who apologized before she had to ask, who smoothed things over so the discomfort would end faster. She was waiting for that man to show up now, the way you wait for a familiar song to hit its chorus. He didn't show up. When he didn't, her face hardened into something colder than anger, something closer to disbelief that the ground beneath her had actually moved. "Fine," she said. "You want to sit here feeling sorry for yourself with your father and his little charity project? Be my guest. This marriage is done, Julian. I hope the guilt keeps you very warm at night." She grabbed her purse from the entryway table, her heels loud and sharp against the hardwood, and walked out. The door didn't slam so much as click shut with a finality that somehow felt louder than any slam could have been. Through the front window, I watched her headlights sweep back down the driveway and out onto the street, and none of us moved until the sound of the engine had faded completely into the ordinary quiet of the neighborhood. The house went very quiet after that. Julian sank onto the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. I ladled soup into a bowl and set it in front of him without a word. Elias pulled a kitchen chair over and sat down beside him. Not across from him, beside him, the way you sit with someone rather than at someone. Nobody delivered a speech. Nobody offered a single word of forgiveness or blame. We just sat there, the three of us, in a kitchen that had held 3 men's grief before, and would apparently go on holding it, while the soup cooled slightly and the house settled around us with the particular silence that comes after a storm has finally blown itself out. At some point, Elias reached over and refilled Julian's water glass without a word, the way you do for family, without announcing it as a kindness. And Julian looked at his own hands for a long moment before he finally said, quietly, to no one in particular, "I don't know how to be the kind of man who shows up like that. I don't even know where you'd start." "You start by showing up once," I told him, "and then you show up again the next time. Nobody arrives at it fully formed, son, not even Elias." Elias gave a small, tired laugh at that, the first sound of anything like lightness the whole long night had allowed. It wasn't peace exactly what settled over that kitchen afterward, but something had begun, quietly, to take root in its place. And I have learned over 70 years that forgiveness rarely announces itself with any fanfare at all. It just starts showing up the way Elias always had, without anyone asking it to, one ordinary bowl of soup at a time. There was no single moment where everything was fixed. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this one too often pretend that a good cry and an apology solve 40 years of distance overnight. They don't. What happened instead over the following months was slower and, I think, more honest than that. Julian moved into a small apartment across town. The divorce proceedings started quietly and finished the same way. No headlines this time, no viral videos, just 2 lawyers and a lot of paperwork. And eventually 2 people who had genuinely wanted very different lives finally admitting it to each other. He started calling me every morning at 7 o'clock, not to explain himself, not out of guilt dressed up as duty. I could tell the difference within the first 2 weeks, because guilt gets tired, and this didn't. He simply called every single day and asked, "How are you today, Dad?" Some mornings I had nothing interesting to report. He called anyway. He started showing up on Saturdays with tools he clearly hadn't used in years, the calluses slowly reappearing on hands that had spent a decade behind a marketing desk. The first Saturday, he showed up with a brand new toolbox, still wearing its store tag, sheepish about it, admitting he'd had to watch 3 videos online just to remember which end of a screwdriver did what. I didn't tease him for it. A man relearning something he should have known all along deserves patience, not mockery. We re-roofed the back porch together that spring. The same porch I'd re-shingled myself 25 years earlier, while Eleanor held the ladder and told me I was going to break my fool neck. Julian handed me nails the way I'd once handed them to him, and neither of us said much, and neither of us needed to. Some Saturdays we mowed the lawn in complete silence, and it felt like the fullest conversation we'd had in years. Other Saturdays he brought over a small toolbox to fix something that wasn't actually broken, just to have a reason to sit on my porch a while longer, and I never once let on that I knew exactly what he was doing. I used to think success meant the biggest house, the nicest vacation, he told me one Saturday afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead, looking out over the yard he'd grown up in. I spent so long chasing that I forgot how to just show up for people. He looked at me. You never stopped showing up? Not once. And I stopped for years and told myself it didn't count because I still loved you. Love that doesn't show up isn't nothing, son, I told him. But it isn't everything either. He nodded slowly, like a man finally memorizing something he should have learned decades earlier. Meanwhile, the Sterling Technical Education Trust had become something bigger than any of us expected. Elias oversaw the construction of the new workshop himself. Real lathes, real welding stations, safety equipment that had never once been second-hand. And within a year, 40 students who otherwise couldn't have afforded vocational training were building robots and rebuilding small engines in a space that finally matched their talent. Local news outlets did a short follow-up segment on the workshop's opening, and Elias, true to form, spent most of the interview redirecting credit to his students instead of himself, mentioning my name only once, briefly, almost as an afterthought, the way a genuinely humble man always does. Julian visited that workshop for the first time on a gray Tuesday in October, nearly a year after the ceremony that had upended all our lives. I watched him walk along the back wall, where a modest brass plaque had been installed without my knowledge or permission. Elias's doing, I found out later, reading simply. Funded in honor of Arthur Sterling, who believed character should outlive a paycheck. Julian stood in front of that plaque for a long time. When he finally turned around, Elias was standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching him with an expression that held no triumph in it at all, only a kind of quiet understanding between 2 men who had, in their very different ways, both learned what it meant to be raised by the same steady man. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Julian crossed the room and shook Elias's hand, and then, after a moment's hesitation, pulled him into a brief, hard embrace, the kind 2 men give each other when words would only get in the way of what they actually mean. 2 years to the month after that first ceremony, Continental Precision Industries held the dedication of a new training annex, funded jointly by the company and the Sterling Trust. A proper building this time, with classrooms and workshop bays and a library stocked with technical manuals for students who had never before had access to anything like it. I sat in the front row, in the same rented suit, in a chair that this time had never once been empty. To my left sat Elias Vance, who now ran the entire mentorship program that had grown out of that first small trust. To my right sat my son. There were no viral videos this time, no cameras hunting for an empty seat, no algorithm looking to punish anyone. Just dozens of young apprentices meeting mentors who genuinely cared about their futures. A room full of ordinary, unglamorous good. And honestly, that mattered far more to me than any headline ever could have. Richard found me near the refreshment table afterward and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did this," he said, gesturing around the room. "All of it started because you believed character should outlive a paycheck." I told him it hadn't been me alone. It had never been me alone, but he only smiled and let me have the small dishonesty, the way old friends do. As we walked out to the parking lot afterward, Julian fell into step beside me, and Elias a few paces behind, talking easily now, the two of them, about a robotics competition one of the students was entering that spring. Julian stopped beside my truck before I climbed in. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, even when I made it about as hard as a person could." I put a hand on his shoulder, the same way I had 100 times when he was small enough for it to feel like it could fix anything. "Being your father was never the hard part, son," I told him. "The hard part was waiting for you to find your way home." He pulled me into a hug then, right there in the parking lot, the kind that lasts a beat or two longer than is strictly necessary between two men, and I let it last exactly as long as he needed it to. Just two young men, one connected to me by blood, and one by a promise made at a dying man's bedside, both of them finally fully present. Not because a scandal had forced them there, but because slowly, painfully, deliberately they had each chosen to be. Money never repaired a single thing in this family. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's the part people get wrong when they hear stories like ours. The trust didn't heal Julian. The viral video didn't heal him either. If anything, it very nearly broke him, in a way that could have gone the other direction entirely. What healed my son was 7 o'clock phone calls he didn't have to make. It was Saturday mornings with a hammer in his hand. It was the slow, humbling work of a man deciding, one unglamorous day at a time, to become someone worth showing up for. Time doesn't run backward. I couldn't give my son back the years he'd spent believing his childhood had been easy, comfortable, unremarkable. I couldn't give Eleanor back the decade of rest her body had earned and never received. But I have come to believe, at 72 years old, sitting in a chair between two men I love in very different ways, that a family isn't a fact you're born into and simply keep. It is a choice you have to keep making, storm after storm, chair after empty chair, until one day you look to your left and your right and realize quietly, without any fanfare at all, that everyone who was supposed to be there finally is.